of Stella's, and I thought it was really important to do that because alongside her activism, Stella is an incredible writer, and I just didn't want that history to get lost. So here is a poem that Stella wrote in the 90s. Indeed. Right. Hello.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Before I say anything, this is really good, isn't it? It's wonderful to see this space, this energy, and I'm really very honoured and humbled to have been asked to participate. The poem I'm going to read you is called Do You Remember? And I hope that it will kind of set the tone for the conversation we're going to have. It was actually written to one of the women who's been a mentor in my life, Gerlin Bean, who now lives in Jamaica. And as I say, it's called Do You Remember? Do you remember, my sister, those dark November nights when we listened to the world and sought to right its sorrows with our clenched fists? Do you remember those languid summer days when we raised our placards high and sang sweet songs of freedom, so sure that history was on our side? The world's cruel burdens weigh heavy still, and time may have tempered our youthful dreams. Yet we have come at last to know a deeper truth. For it is people, not ideals, that are transient. And freedom's spirit lives on, imprisoned in the shy smile of a hungry child, and in a fierce, enduring love that conquers fear. Thank you.
Round of applause, please. All right, let's get into it. So, Stella, you were born in the early 50s in London to a Ghanaian father, English mother. And I think it would be really good to set the context by telling people what those kind of formative experiences of racism were like for you that so inspired you to want to go on and become an organizer. So what was your childhood like?
How long have you got? It was, I think, as for many people of mixed heritage, quite a confusing and difficult childhood. I spent my life in and out of care. I was fostered at an early age. And my mother, to give her her due, fought to get me back. So I was returned as a 4-year-old to live with a white woman who was effectively a stranger and who was quite deeply damaged herself from her experience of being spat on in the street. Those of you who are of mixed heritage will possibly know that certainly in the 50s, I was born in 1952, a white woman who went with a black man was basically characterised as a prostitute before she opened her mouth. It was assumed that the only women who would have relationships with black men were living on the dark side. So she was quite damaged and spent a lot of my childhood trying to make me cover my hair, not go in the sun, do all those things that she thought would help me to survive. But I was fortunate in that I came to know my father's family again in my before I even reached my teens, and was suddenly swept into a very different world, which was the world of an African diplomat. My father was an activist. He had fought side by side with Nkrumah for the liberation of Ghana, so he was strongly anti-colonialist and represented, a new and dawning Africa, independent Africa. So I felt, I always feel that my ability to adapt to basically any situation I'm thrown into comes from those extremes I experienced as a child, where I lived with my mother in real poverty and would be swept into this world. And I always say that I was a socialist from the age of 12, because I would look at the food on my father's table and think, but me and my mum, it would be a month before we'd have enough money to buy this amount of food. And I always felt it was unfair and unjust, even before I had the words to articulate it. So I think that was formative for me. And then, of course, I was thrown out of school and ended up filling in my UCA form wrong and studying German, which had not been my aspiration. So at the tender age of 19, I think I found myself in Bavaria as a young black woman sticking out like a sore thumb. And by the end of that year, I had grown a very, very, very large afro and came back keen to connect with other black people who were engaged in the struggle against racism. And that's because I think Germany for me was my first encounter with something that I wouldn't call lace curtain racism. Does everybody understand that term? The lace curtain racism that we associate with this country is the kind that involves the landlady twitching the curtain, and then when she answers the door, she doesn't say, "No, I don't want any black folks living in my house." She says, "Oh, sorry, the room just went." Yeah? Lace curtain racism is still racism, but it's couched in a slight kind of diplomatic, non-confrontational language. So going to Germany, where people literally would grab your hair from behind on the bus and have a conversation about whether it felt like wool, was kind of an eye-opener. And when I came back to England, I was, as I say, keen to engage and got involved with African Red Family, Black Liberator and other radical organisations, and I guess the rest is history.
Can I just check, can you hear me?
You know that when I was introduced to my father's world, where there was an expectation that people would clear up after you, I was fiercely opposed to that. I couldn't see why on earth I would want somebody to make my bed for me or clean my bath for me. That just seemed to me anathema. And
I think it's important, before we talk about Heart of the Race, to understand the politics that gave birth to the book. And so alongside socialism, you mentioned your father's anti-colonial background. But I wanted to also go back to Germany, because when you met those feminists in Germany, or you were engaging with the kind of African, you were engaging with African women who were part of liberation movements.
there was no women in Germany, black women anyway, unless they were operating out of the bordellos in Hamburg. And that was part of the problem. The idea that you could be a black woman studying, I was studying languages, I was in Erlangen to begin with and then in Heidelberg, they just couldn't get their head around it, so men would follow me home. And I was, forget about Me Too, you know, it was 24/7 harassment, just this assumption that you were available sexually. And it was an extremely isolating experience. And I didn't know any other black women, but what I did know was black men who were fresh from the liberation struggles in Africa. There were Eritrean refugees, there were people coming from Zimbabwe, and I don't know the age of this audience, but there certainly will be some here, I hope, who will connect with a time in the 70s when Africa was in ferment. I mean, it still is, but in a different kind of way. And those brothers were absolutely clear about the hundreds of years of exploitation that had led us to the place where we were at. And they were hugely radicalising. So when I came back to the UK after that experience, I was working in what was still predominantly male organisations, but when you met a sister, boy, you reached out because, you know, it was just the two of you, and it was that isolation that actually led to the women who became the founder members of OWAAD coming together and saying, we need something of our own, we need something that is specifically for black women and about black women. So there was definitely a thirst for it then, as there's a thirst for it now. But that was the context in which we began.
And Heart of the Race sort of comes towards the end of OWAAD's life. Can you tell us a bit about, I guess, the trajectory of OWAAD and Yeah, maybe we should start with Heart of the Race before we talk about why OWAAD disappeared into history. But Heart of the Race, who commissioned you to write the book?
We were commissioned by Virago, which was the woman's publisher, to write, I suppose, a sister book to Amrit Wilson's Finding a Voice, which incidentally has also recently been republished, which looked at the experience of women from the Indian subcontinent. And it was so successful and so widely sought after that we were approached, or at least I was approached because I was doing work with Virago at the time, to see if we could write something similar. And because of the way we worked in OWAAD, which was very much as a collective, our initial effort to write the book began in what we called the Book Collective, which just said, anyone who's interested in helping us write a book, come to this meeting. Of course, anyone who's ever read a book will know that that's not how books get written. And, you know, it was also true that women's lives make it difficult to write. We have children, we have careers, we have other demands on our lives, so for all those reasons, what started off as a fairly healthy size group whittled down to what was literally 2 or 3 of us. And in the end, we took it on and said, okay, we're going to see this project through to the end. And that's how it is that 3 names are on the book. Education was foremost for a lot of us, those of us who were beginning to have families, the experience we'd had in schools, the experience our children were still having in schools. I heard the keynote speech this morning where Jamila was talking about the teacher's response to her exuberant daughter, and I thought, you know, how much has changed. So education was always going to be up there in lights for us. Employment, the road black women had taken through slavery and colonialism right to the present moment of, you know, working to produce the wealth of this country. That was also going to be up there. And many of the women who were involved weren't just students, they were nurses, they were cleaners, they were people who were doing the work of keeping this country going.
And what's beautiful is that I guess you saw value in them, not because of their position, but because of the fact that they existed. And I think it feels like that was very central to your politics.
I think that's a socialism. You know, when you asked that question earlier, it's difficult to define, isn't it? But to me, it's about recognising that everybody is of value. And in my career, working with colleges and schools and universities and trying to train people around these issues, I've always said, you know, the person who cleans your floors is as important as the person who you describe as principal, because each one of them helps this place to operate. And actually, if you took the cleaner away, the place would fall apart much quicker. Not only that, the cleaner is probably the person who knows better what's going on in the institution, because she or he will hear, you know, the conversations that will never reach up to the ivory towers. So it's about recognising your own worth, regardless, and not being defined by career or income.
Absolutely. Okay, so you've written this book, and then did the publication, did that coincide with the end of OWAAD, or were you there for a little bit longer?
I think we were at it a bit longer, but I hadn't actually finished your other question. I was just going to say how we found the women was through our networks. And again, I talked about, you know, the grapevine and the oral grapevine. Everybody knew somebody, because we were active in our communities, not just around women's issues, whatever that might be, but around education, around the sus laws, you know, a law that said you could be arrested on suspicion of being about to commit a crime. Yeah? Get your head around that if you've got a black son. Or indeed a black daughter these days, but in those days it was like they were on those black boys. We were organising around all these issues, so we had supplementary schools, we had Saturday schools, we had women organising around sickle cell, so we had a tremendously effective network, and quite a lot of the women are mothers and sisters and aunties and grannies of the women that we knew, so it wasn't difficult finding them.
Okay, brilliant. And then to go on to OWAAD, much has sort of been written about why it ended. People often say it had to do with the kind of tensions of Afro-Asian unity, the tensions around people's sexual identities, and I know that you don't always agree with the sort of general way that we've memorialised that demise. So, can you tell us a bit about why it ended, and then we'll kind of talk to those tensions?
I quite honestly don't recognise the narrative that I hear quite often in relation to OWAAD, because I do believe that all organisations are of their time. You know, they arise when they're needed, and if they fall away, it's because something else has taken their place, or we've moved on, or we need to carry on. And I couldn't really say that I saw any particular issue as tearing OWAAD apart, although there were tensions at certain conferences that arose out of those issues. That was only part of the picture. Because I'm a historian, I like to remind people of the complexity of any single incident. You know, if all of us leave this room today, I don't know, what are there, 40, 50 people in the room? There'll probably be 40, 50 different versions of what happened here today, yeah? Just because we all experience things in a slightly different way. So my feeling is that, you know, OWAAD was ahead of its time in that we quickly recognised, we originally set up as the women of Africa and African descent, yeah? And it was within months that we changed our name to Women of African and Asian descent. And that was challenged. People said, what's that about? And, you know, Asian people don't see themselves as black. All that stuff was going on then. But what we recognise as women is that racism and sexism may manifest itself differently in our communities, but actually the enemy, the manifester of those isms was the same. And because we were women who understood our history, we understood how effective divide and rule has been in our communities over the centuries, we were determined to find commonality with anyone who shared a common goal. And it was very early on in OWAAD's existence that a young sister marched into the room who completely threw my stereotypes out of the window. She was an Asian woman in motorbike leathers. And she said, what about me? What about us? And we kind of looked at her quizzically and thought, yeah. And she said, well, I'm from Africa. And of course, we're talking about the 70s when a large number of Asian people were coming from East Africa as a result of the Africanization policies in East Africa, and who had probably more in-depth knowledge of Africa than any one of us around that table. So when they started talking to us about things like virginity testing, where women who came to this country from the Asian subcontinent were required, before they'd gone through immigration, to get up onto a gurney and spread their legs and have an internal examination to ascertain whether they were actually virgins, because some bureaucrat had decided that if Asian women were coming here, it must be for an arranged marriage, and Asian women aren't allowed to marry, are they, because unless they were virgins. That was literally going on at Heathrow Airport. Now, as black women, we looked at that practice and said, there but for the grace of God go I. And for that reason, we made common cause with those systems, that and other reasons as well, and made it clear that although we recognise that the priorities and the issues in our communities might be different, even the ways we could organise might be different, we should come together and voice collectively our objection and our opposition to those kind of practices, just as we would object to the other practices that affected people of African and Caribbean origin at the point of entry into this country.
Earlier, you were asking about my own journey in organising, and I kind of said that I haven't stopped. I just feel like I've grown a little bit and have changed tact with what I do. So could you speak a bit to that journey for yourself?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's interesting when people talk about the demise of OWAAD, they talk about it as if it ended, but it didn't. And there's no black woman in public life today, certainly my generation, who didn't in some way get moulded in that crucible. And I think all of us, one way or another, took the politics that we had developed in OWAAD into our homes, into our working lives, into our careers. In my case, I was always a teacher, And it's interesting because I was thrown out of school and said I would never go into another school in all my life, but I ended up kind of getting drawn into it because I loved the kids. And I loved the idea of young minds that could be formed and could think independently. So I was always a teacher, but I very quickly realised that teaching German wasn't going to be my thing. Even though I sprang around the classroom talking about this family that lived in Namibia and spoke German, you know, I wasn't going to have Herr and Frau Schmidt in Heidelberg. And, you know, being the only black teacher in the school, that worked as well. But I was very drawn to the pastoral side and very quickly got involved in the campaigns around the curriculum, around, you know, the underachievement of black children, the unacceptable levels of school exclusions and all those things that were happening. I can't begin to sum up my career in a couple of minutes, but what I will say is that, you know, that was the journey that started me off, and I ended up actually, I think in about 1988, saying, enough, I'm not working for these people anymore, I'm going to do my own thing. And I actually had this fairly idealised notion that I was going to be a starving artist in the garret and write, and just sort of go out and do training one day a week just to kind of keep the bills paid. And I was a single parent, so I did have to do that. But actually, anybody who's set up their own business knows it's 24/7, and if you have time to write, you know, that's a luxury. So I ended up doing a lot of work which involved developing resources to support teachers, lecturers, managers. I worked with, you know, across the world with the United Nations, trying to promote adult education, but always with black people and women at the forefront of my focus.
And very funny to kind of, and what I've been most struck by is the fact that what we regard as the public and voluntary sectors, actually all of that was your organising, but it's sort of been whitewashed in a way that we talk about it as though it was just people volunteering their time rather than providing a real challenge to the state. How do you think of the erasure of black women in the UK? Is it something that you reflect on at all?
Erasure?
Yeah, the erasure, I guess specifically of our organising in the UK.
You know, I went on to study history at MA at SciAS because that was my love, and it was a real journey trying to find black women anywhere. We were so invisible, and I specialised in looking at slavery and resistance to slavery. In fact, I should do this now and say that my next book is going to come out and will be looking at that very subject. But I was mindful at the time of how hard it was to unearth those hidden histories. And I think part of the problem is that we've been kind of, this generation anyway, has been raised on this kind of Black History Month, White History Year kind of story. You know, our history is more than a month. And actually, I'm going to be really controversial, so there's no such thing as black history. And I'll tell you why I say that. Because it allows, it's a get-out clause. When I worked a few years ago on the Mayor of London's Commission for Heritage to promote African and Asian heritage in the major London institutions, you know, National Gallery, British Library, British Museum, we would come across people who would say, well, I'm a specialist in 19th century history, but I don't know anything about black history. And my response to that was, excuse me, that is your history. That history of coming to my country and cutting my hand off because I didn't produce enough rubber for you, that's your history too. Don't you dare act like we dropped out of some other planet and that we've got this separate history going on the side. Now, I'm not saying that Black History Month hasn't served its purpose to put a focus on the issues that have been hidden from history. But what I think we really need to be doing is making that demand and saying, no more Black History Month, White History Year. We want it integrated all the way through. We don't want teachers who tell our kids to come in dressed as slaves. We want teachers who have the sensitivity, the consciousness, the awareness to understand how to tackle that history in a way that doesn't shame our children. One of the reasons I'm writing about slavery, and it's not a sexy subject, believe, is because I think it's a travesty that our children take objection to learning about slavery in the classroom. And I tell you why. I don't think Jewish people feel ashamed of learning about the Holocaust, because the story of the Holocaust is a story of resistance, of survival, of retaining humanity despite what they tried to do to you. That's our story too, you know. And when you look at the role of black women, both in struggling against slavery and indeed ensuring our community's survival up until now, you know, that is a story that is yet to be told. But you know what fires me up, and this will be my final point, when I listened to that sister this morning on the stage, I was thinking, you know, this generation ain't going to put up with that. I can see from your faces, I can see, you know. You know, and I know that, you know, some of you are going to take this away and go and do something with it. You're going to set up a website, you're going to do things, because that's where you're at. You know, the energy, the power, the sense of self-belief, which I think did come out of that spirit of OWAAD, is very much alive and well today. But my word of caution is this: don't allow our focus on unearthing those stories to just dwell on individuals, because you know most of the history that needs to be told is the collective history of anonymous people who will never be named. I'm sure Mary Seacole was a wonderful sister, but you know what? There was a lot of doctresses and nurses and black women who struggled out of slavery and used their knowledge of herbs to develop medical practices that have ensured our survival, who will never be known. And I think that's the story that we need to focus on. The collective masses of black men and women who died unsung and unacknowledged, but who are nevertheless part of our survival. And I walk with the knowledge that I'm here today because of something someone did before I came.
Ashe.
Yes.